Rome called itself the heart of civilization, an empire of law, order, and glory. But hidden behind its marble palaces and crowded streets was another Rome, one so dark that even its own historians dared not describe it. In that shadow lived women without names, female slaves. To their masters, they were not people but property, tools to be used, controlled, and discarded. Their suffering was not an accident of history. It was the foundation of Roman power. The laws that protected soldiers and senators stripped these women of humanity. Every choice stolen, every right denied. And when punishment came, it was designed not just to hurt, but to erase dignity itself. So horrific were some of these practices that Rome tried to bury them in silence. No scroll recorded the darkest rituals. No stone carving dared to capture the reality. Yet fragments remain, in forgotten writings, in the bones left behind, in whispers carried across centuries. They tell us that what Rome considered normal, the modern world would call unthinkable. These women were forced into acts of pain and humiliation so grotesque, so calculated, that they can hardly be spoken aloud. And yet for Rome they were ordinary, routine. Another night in a villa, another day in the empire's endless machinery of control. This is not the Rome of triumphs and golden statues. This is the Rome that thrived on silence, the Rome that fed on fear. And tonight we open that silence. We step into the shadows, uncovering the forbidden practices inflicted upon female slaves, truths so disturbing they were never meant to be written down. The Roman Empire stretched across continents, devouring lands, peoples, and cultures with a hunger that never seemed to end. Its armies thundered through valleys and mountains, its banners planted in soil that once belonged to free nations. And with every conquest, the same fate awaited the defeated. Men were slaughtered, children torn from their homes, and women carried away into the shadow of slavery. Among those women was one who had no name left to call her own. She had once belonged to the rolling hills of a distant province, where her skin burned beneath the summer sun and her hair carried the scent of wild fields. But the legions had come, ironclad and merciless. Her family was scattered like dust before the storm, her village reduced to silence. In the aftermath, she was shackled, marched in a line of captives toward the very heart of the world that had destroyed her home, Rome. The city that rose before her was nothing like the quiet simplicity she had known. Marble columns towered into the sky. Roads stretched endlessly, filled with voices in a language that fell sharp and alien on her ears. There was music, laughter, fountains spraying cool water into the air. But all of it seemed carved out of cruelty, for it existed upon the suffering of countless like her. Where citizens saw beauty, she saw chains. Where they saw triumph, she saw broken lives. She was given a new name upon arrival, one chosen by her master's whim. Her old name, her true name, was lost in that moment, swallowed into silence. To the master and his household, she was nothing but property, a body to command, a servant to endure endless toil, and a reminder that Rome's victories were written not only in blood, but also in the suffering of women, stripped of freedom. Her days began long before dawn. The air was still heavy with night when she was forced to rise. She cleaned, prepared food, carried water through the endless halls of the villa. The Roman elite lived lives of unimaginable luxury, banquets dripping with roasted meats and exotic spices, floors glittering with mosaics, walls painted in dazzling colors. But for her, these things were not signs of wealth. They were daily reminders of her insignificance. For every jewel placed upon a noble's neck, there were dozens of hands like hers that bled to keep that jewel polished. The villa itself was a prison disguised as a palace. Beneath its surface, hidden behind laughter and music, stretched corridors of silence. Slave quarters lay in damp corners where light barely reached. Straw mats served as beds. The stench of sweat and fear lingered in the air, never fully fading. At night, the silence was broken only by muffled cries, cries that quickly died, for even suffering had to be silent here. Rome prided itself on order, but that order was built upon terror. A slave could be beaten, branded, or worse without reason, and no law would intervene. For women, the torment took on even darker forms. Their bodies were commodities, used and discarded at the whim of their masters. To resist was to invite punishment so severe that even whispers of it carried dread among the enslaved. Some punishments were routine, inflicted casually, as though pain were no more than a passing chore. Others were the kind of horrors Rome never wrote down, secrets buried in silence. Her existence was one of constant fear. The sound of footsteps approaching her quarters meant her breath caught in her throat. The weight of a master's gaze was heavier than the chains on her wrists. There were places in the villa she dreaded, the locked chambers where screams were never allowed to escape, the courtyards where punishments were displayed to remind others of their powerlessness. Even the baths, shimmering with scented oils and polished marble, became spaces of humiliation, where her body was stripped not only of clothes but of dignity. Yet the cruelty was not only in what was done to her, but also in what was stolen from her. The right to dream, to remember, to hope. Days blurred into nights, nights into days until time itself seemed meaningless. She existed in a suspended state of survival, caught between the memory of freedom and the crushing reality of bondage. Rome called itself eternal, but for her, eternity was nothing but an endless cycle of labor and pain. Each morning she rose with the hope that perhaps today would bring mercy, and each night she lay down with the weight of new scars, some carved into flesh, others buried deeper, carved into the soul. And still she endured, for in her silence she carried fragments of memory. The sound of wind across the hills of her homeland, the warmth of a sun that had once kissed her skin without cruelty, the faint taste of freedom. These memories were faint, fragile, but they were hers. Rome could rename her, break her, and bury her under endless humiliation, but somewhere inside a part of her resisted. What she could not know was that darker truths still awaited her. Punishments whispered among the enslaved, but never spoken aloud. Practices too horrifying for the empire to record, yet too common for it to be rare. Secrets hidden in the very foundations of the villa, where pain and silence became inseparable. The marble city sparkled in the daylight, celebrated for its power and beauty. But in its shadows, a different Rome thrived. A Rome of chains, of broken lives, of women whose suffering was erased by the silence of history. And she was trapped within it, moving step by step toward the moment when the empire's darkest practices would reveal themselves in full. Morning in Rome began not with peace, but with commands. Whips cracked long before the city stirred, summoning the enslaved from straw pallets into endless cycles of labor. For the citizens, the rising sun was a promise of pleasure. Markets bustling with food, baths steaming with luxury, games awaiting in the amphitheater. But for the female slaves hidden in villas and insulae, dawn was simply the beginning of another day of survival. She rose as ordered, her body aching, skin marked by the invisible bruises of exhaustion. The villa's grandeur loomed above her, mosaics glittering under torchlight as if mocking her misery. In the eyes of Rome, her existence was not life, it was utility. She was one of thousands, a faceless figure swallowed into the machinery of an empire that celebrated dominance while erasing the humanity of those it dominated. Daily tasks consumed her hours. She carried amphorae heavy with water, polished floors until her hands bled, tended to the endless needs of her master's household. Each order was barked with the certainty that obedience was her only purpose. To falter was to invite retribution. To hesitate was to remind the master that punishment was always near. Yet it was not only labor that stripped her of identity. It was the ever-present knowledge that her body was property. Roman law made this clear. The enslaved were objects owned entirely, with no right to resist. Female slaves bore a unique burden, for their suffering extended into realms no scroll openly described. Their humiliation was institutional, repeated in ways that blurred boundaries between routine and atrocity. Whispers moved among the enslaved when they were certain no ear of authority lingered. They spoke of punishments inflicted not to correct mistakes, but to demonstrate ownership. They spoke of rituals masked as discipline, so cruel that they left scars deeper than flesh. They spoke of chambers where light never reached, places reserved for women who displeased their masters in ways too small to matter and too great to forgive. The villa itself seemed to breathe with cruelty. Its grand halls echoed with the laughter of guests, senators and nobles, who feasted upon abundance while never glimpsing the hands that prepared it. Above, the clatter of cups and music carried through the walls. Below, the silence of the enslaved was absolute. Even their pain was ordered to remain unseen. Cries were smothered, voices broken, until silence became a second chain around their necks. She learned to move without sound, to shrink into corners, to accept invisibility as protection. But invisibility could not shield her from everything. There were nights when she was summoned without explanation, paraded before the eyes of strangers as though she were another piece of furniture, examined for obedience, endurance, and submission. And there were times when those who vanished into hidden chambers did not return, their names fading into absence, their silence absorbed into the stone of the villa. The cruelty of Rome was not sudden, it was woven into the very fabric of its power. The empire did not need to shout its dominance, it whispered it through daily rituals of humiliation. Every act, no matter how small, reminded the enslaved that they were nothing more than possessions. To serve food was not service. It was a reminder that their hands would never touch it freely. To clean the villa was not duty. It was evidence that their sweat existed, to polish another's luxury. What made it unbearable was how ordinary it all became. For the masters, cruelty was routine. For the enslaved, suffering became life. The line between punishment and existence blurred until they were indistinguishable. And the darkest practices, the ones Rome would never admit, were passed down as though they were traditions accepted without question, hidden behind the respectable facade of civilization. She carried these truths in silence, her body a map of endurance. She had no voice to challenge the system, no law to protect her, no hope to escape. And yet she survived. In each passing day, she clung to fragments of memory, pieces of her identity that Rome could never fully erase. But survival carried a cost, for each sunrise brought her closer to the inevitable, the moment when whispers of horror would no longer remain whispers, but reality. The empire was relentless, and within its marble heart the fate of female slaves was sealed. Their suffering was not a secret to those who lived it. The only secret was that Rome never allowed the truth to be written, and soon she would learn why. Rome thrived on appearances. To the citizens, it was a world of marble temples, chariots thundering through the Circus Maximus, senators wrapped in pristine togas. But beneath this facade lay the machinery of cruelty, an empire built upon the lives of the enslaved. And for women like her, the weight of that machinery pressed down with every breath. Her days blended into one another, yet each carried new forms of humiliation. She learned that slavery was not a single chain, but 1,000 invisible ones. A gesture, a glance, a silence, all reminders of her place. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled, prepared food she could not taste, clothed women who mocked her nakedness. And always, she felt the invisible line separating her from those who laughed above her. That line was Rome's greatest weapon, the belief that she was less than human. In the villa's grand dining hall, banquets stretched into the night. Platters of roasted meat, bowls of honeyed fruit, cups overflowing with wine, abundance beyond measure. But for the enslaved, these nights were not celebrations. They were spectacles of submission. She and others were forced to stand silently, serving food with heads bowed, bodies displayed as though they were ornaments in the performance of wealth. Every laugh, every toast, every song seemed to echo with the same unspoken truth. Their suffering was entertainment. The punishments grew harsher in this stage of her life. Rome prided itself on law, but those laws protected only citizens. For slaves, the whip was law. A single mistake, a dish spilled, a step too slow, a glance too long brought retribution. The lash carved welts into her back, her skin a canvas of discipline. But the whip was only the beginning. There were punishments designed not merely to cause pain, but to erase dignity. Some were inflicted in private, others before crowds, each leaving scars that could not be hidden. Whispers spread among the enslaved about what happened to those who defied too openly. A woman who resisted the advances of her master vanished one night, her absence explained only by silence. Another, accused of theft she did not commit, was paraded through the courtyard, her body marked for all to see. Rome did not punish in secrecy. It punished to remind others of their powerlessness. The villa had places she feared most. There were chambers where light barely touched, their doors heavy and iron-bound. She passed them often in her chores, each time feeling the weight of dread press against her chest. From within, faint sounds sometimes escaped, a cry stifled too quickly, the scrape of chains, the silence of breath cut short. No one spoke of these rooms, but all knew what they meant. They were the empire's unspoken truth, a space where cruelty could flourish without witness. Beyond the villa, the city itself was no refuge. Markets bustled with trade, amphitheaters roared with bloodsport, but in every corner, the enslaved toiled in shadows. Women carried water jars taller than themselves, bent under the weight of others' demands. Some were sold in markets like cattle, their bodies inspected and prodded as merchants boasted of their obedience. The humiliation was not hidden, it was spectacle, normalized by the empire that claimed to embody civilization. She carried memories of her homeland like fading embers. The hills, the laughter of her family, the warmth of freedom, each now a ghostly fragment. Rome had stolen not just her body, but her story. Her name erased, her past denied, she lived in the present only as property. And yet in secret she clung to those embers. They were fragile, but they were hers. The cruelty of Rome was systematic, but it was also casual. Citizens laughed as slaves struggled under loads too heavy, as though suffering were part of the city's entertainment. Children of nobles mocked the enslaved, imitating their accents, reminding them daily that they were foreigners in a land that thrived on their subjugation. For female slaves, humiliation carried the sharpest edge. They were vulnerable not only to labor, but to violations of the body, treated as possessions in ways so grotesque that history itself often turned away from the truth. And yet even within this nightmare, bonds formed among the enslaved. They shared glances of understanding, silent gestures of comfort, small acts of defiance hidden from watchful eyes. A scrap of food passed in secrecy, a whispered prayer, a hand that steadied another's trembling shoulders. These moments did not undo their suffering, but they reminded them of humanity, a humanity Rome worked tirelessly to deny. For her, survival became a ritual. She learned when to lower her eyes, when to move quickly, when to vanish into silence. But survival was never guaranteed. Every day brought new risks, new tests of endurance, and with each passing moment, she felt the looming presence of something darker still. The whispers among slaves spoke not only of punishments, but of practices that blurred the line between discipline and ritual. Acts carried out not for correction, but for domination, designed to strip away the last fragments of resistance. Rome celebrated its conquests with triumphal processions, parading captives through the streets before their final destruction. For enslaved women, every day was its own triumph, a display of power by those who owned them. She could feel it in the way masters spoke of her, as though she were an object to be traded, discarded, or broken at will. She could feel it in the way punishments lingered long after the pain, faded, leaving her spirit hollowed, and always there was the silence. Rome's greatest cruelty was not only what it inflicted, but what it concealed. The empire recorded its laws, its victories, its monuments, but the lives of women like her remained unwritten. Their pain was buried beneath marble, their voices lost to the dust of centuries. What remained were only traces, whispers, and scars. She lived in that silence day after day, step after step, waiting for the moment when the shadows would reveal what they had hidden all along. For if the daily life of a female slave was unbearable, the punishments that awaited beyond it were something else entirely, secrets Rome never allowed to be written. The villa was a palace of contradictions. To those who visited, it was splendor. Mosaic floors glistening like stars, gardens perfumed with roses, marble statues whispering of gods and heroes. But for the enslaved, beauty was a cage. Every wall, every polished surface reminded her of power she would never hold. The air itself was heavy, perfumed not with flowers but with submission. Her labor stretched from dawn until well past dusk. She carried water until her shoulders ached, cleaned courtyards on her knees until her skin cracked, and endured the endless summons of her mistress, who used cruelty as entertainment. Some days she was ordered to stand motionless for hours, while noble women tried on garments she had sewn. Other days, she was forced to kneel in the center of a gathering, not as a person but as an object of ridicule. Laughter burned more deeply than the lash. Rome believed punishment was theater. Every act of discipline was designed not only to wound the body, but to display the imbalance of power. One night, when a group of slaves was accused of plotting to escape, the villa became a stage of terror. They were dragged into the courtyard, torches casting monstrous shadows on the walls. Bound and gagged, they were paraded before their peers. Some were whipped until blood glistened in the torchlight, while others were branded with heated iron. Each scream carried a message. Resistance was not only futile, it was deadly. But the most chilling punishments were reserved for women. They were crafted to linger not in the body but in the soul. Humiliations that could not be spoken, violations so grotesque they existed outside of law and history. These punishments erased not just freedom, but identity. Women ceased to be daughters, sisters, or mothers. They became shadows of themselves, empty vessels molded by fear. The villa was not unique. Across the empire, similar horrors unfolded in silence. In Rome's marketplaces, female slaves were stripped bare, sold under the gaze of leering men who inspected them like livestock. Some were sent to brothels, where their suffering became an economy. Others were given to soldiers, their bodies part of the spoils of conquest. For the empire, there was no boundary between ownership and violation. The female body was simply another commodity, like wheat, oil, or wine. At night, she lay awake listening to the muffled sobs of others. The dormitory smelled of sweat and despair, the air thick with whispers of fear. Some prayed to forgotten gods, others dreamed of escape. But escape was nearly impossible. Slaves who ran were hunted like animals. Those who were caught endured fates worse than death, fates designed to terrify the ones who remained. The empire did not need chains on every limb. Fear itself was the shackle. And yet, within the cracks of oppression, fragments of resistance survived. She saw it in the way some women taught secret songs of their homeland, their voices soft but defiant. She saw it in the small kindnesses, water shared, wounds tended, bread smuggled from kitchens. These acts did not overthrow Rome, but they reminded the enslaved that they were still human, that the empire had not yet succeeded in erasing their souls. Still, the shadows grew darker. Rumors spread of punishments so vile they could not be spoken aloud. Whispers told of women who disappeared, of rituals performed in silence, of masters who turned cruelty into spectacle. The more she heard, the more she understood that her suffering was not the end, it was preparation. Something worse awaited, a cruelty designed not only to destroy her but to serve as a warning to others. The amphitheater loomed as the ultimate symbol of Rome's appetite for violence. Citizens cheered as men slaughtered one another, as beasts tore captives apart. But behind the public arena were private chambers, spaces where cruelty was hidden from the crowd, where female slaves endured punishments Rome refused to record. Some whispered that these punishments were more horrifying than the arena itself, because they were not about bloodshed, but about annihilation of dignity. She lived with the dread of being chosen. Every day, every command carried the weight of possibility. Would this be the day her master decided her fate? Would she vanish into one of those silent chambers, never to return? The fear consumed her, and yet it also sharpened her awareness. Every sound, every shadow became a warning. Every smile from her mistress concealed the possibility of betrayal. Time itself lost meaning. Days bled into nights, nights into days, each marked by labor and fear. The seasons changed, flowers blooming, leaves falling, rains flooding the streets. But her life remained a constant cycle of humiliation. Rome's greatness was built upon this constancy, upon the endless suffering of those who had no voice. She remembered the words once whispered by an older woman, a slave who had seen decades of cruelty. Rome does not kill us quickly. It kills us slowly, piece by piece, until nothing remains but obedience. Those words echoed in her mind as she endured each passing day. She wondered how much of herself had already been erased, how much longer she could survive before nothing remained. The villa's walls held secrets deeper than marble could reveal. And within those secrets lay the practices Rome never wanted recorded. The punishments crafted not for justice, but for domination, not for correction, but for spectacle. She could feel it, pressing closer with each passing day, the shadow of horrors yet to be unveiled. And so the stage was set. She was no longer merely a servant in a villa. She was a pawn in Rome's greater machinery of cruelty. Every humiliation, every wound, every whisper of dread was leading her toward the moment when the hidden truths of the empire would emerge. The rising action of her suffering had only begun. The silence of the villa broke one night with the sound of iron hinges. She had been taken from her duties without explanation, her wrists bound, her body dragged through corridors she had never been allowed to enter. The torches along the walls flickered, casting jagged shadows, and for the first time she realized that the villa was not only a place of wealth, it was a labyrinth of cruelty. She was thrown into a chamber where the air itself seemed poisoned. The walls were bare stone, the floor stained with marks no scrubbing could erase. In the center stood an object she had seen only in whispers, a wooden frame cruel in its design, crafted not for work but for torment. The sight stole her breath. She knew instinctively that this was not a place of discipline. It was a place of erasure. Her master's voice cut through the darkness, calm and deliberate. Punishment, he explained, was necessary. Not for a crime, not for defiance, but to remind others of their place. She was to be the example, the embodiment of submission. Her body was no longer her own. It was Rome's stage. Hands seized her, forcing her into position. The wood pressed against her skin, ropes biting into her wrists and ankles. She could not move, could not resist. The chamber filled with the low hum of anticipation, the kind that belongs not to justice, but to cruelty disguised as law. The first lash burned across her back. It was not the pain alone that consumed her, but the certainty that her suffering was spectacle. Every strike echoed against the stone walls, each one carving not just into her flesh, but into the memory of those forced to watch. She was no longer a woman. She was a warning. But the lash was only the beginning. Rome's punishments were designed to linger, to destroy not only the body but the soul. Implements of humiliation followed, rituals so grotesque they blurred the line between punishment and ritual sacrifice. Her cries dissolved into silence as the chamber devoured her voice, leaving only echoes that would haunt the enslaved who witnessed. Time fractured. Minutes felt like hours, hours like eternities. Her vision blurred, her body trembling on the edge of collapse. And yet, through the haze of torment, one thought pierced the darkness. This was not about her. It was about power, about an empire that needed cruelty to sustain itself. Rome thrived not on marble or law, but on the destruction of lives like hers. When at last the punishment ended, she was unrecognizable. Her body broken, her spirit stripped raw, she was cast aside like refuse. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. Among the enslaved who had been forced to watch, a seed of defiance stirred. They saw not weakness, but truth. Rome's strength was built on fear, and fear could be broken. The chamber door closed with a final echo. Her fate was sealed, her voice silenced. But her suffering did not vanish. It became memory, it became warning, it became whisper. And in those whispers, Rome's greatest secret was revealed, that its glory was carved not from victory, but from the blood and silence of the enslaved. The chamber closed behind her, and with it, the silence of Rome grew heavier than ever. She did not return to the villa's halls as she once had. What staggered back was no longer the same woman who had scrubbed floors and served banquets. Her body bore scars that would never heal, but the deeper wound was invisible, the theft of dignity, the deliberate erasure of humanity. Yet Rome, in its arrogance, failed to see what it had created. In trying to turn her into a symbol of fear, the empire had also forged a memory too sharp to be forgotten. The enslaved who watched did not see obedience carved into flesh. They saw the cruelty of power laid bare. Her suffering became a mirror, reflecting the truth of Rome's so-called civilization, that beneath marble and law, it was an empire built on blood and silence. Life in the villa continued. Banquets resumed, laughter returned, and the nobles congratulated themselves on their authority. But beneath the surface, something stirred. The enslaved moved with the same quiet submission, but their glances lingered longer. Their silence carried a weight Rome could not measure. Whispers spread, not of escape, but of remembrance. They carried fragments of her story like contraband, passing it from one soul to another, ensuring it would not be erased. For the masters, she was nothing more than an example, a tool of fear. For those in chains, she became something greater, proof that Rome's cruelty was not invisible, not invincible, that even in the darkest chamber, humanity endured in memory and solidarity and silent defiance. Centuries later, Rome's marble would crumble. Its temples would fall, its laws forgotten, its emperors reduced to names in history. But the pain endured by women like her, the forgotten, the voiceless, remained etched into the very foundation of the empire's legacy. Rome's glory was temporary, its cruelty was eternal, and perhaps that is the greatest punishment of all, not that the empire triumphed, but that it can never wash away the truth. That every stone of its monuments was built upon suffering, that the voices it silenced still echo, whispering the question that refuses to die. How many empires have called themselves civilized while hiding their foundations in the suffering of the voiceless?